Part 3, Arrow, page 187 to 202. The light bulb in Nermin Filipovic's office seemed more oppressive than ever. Arrow would like to know nothing more than to reach up and swat it, sending it flying into the ceiling. She resists the temptation, knows that the sound of the bulb breaking would bring an aide scurrying into the room to investigate. He would replace the bulb. It would accomplish nothing. It probably wouldn't even make her feel better. She sits alone for nearly half an hour before Nermin arrives. He looks like he hasn't slept in days. He barely seems to notice her. "It's done," she says as he falls into his chair. "He's dead?" Nermin asks, looking at her for the first time. Arrow nods. She's never seen him like this and doesn't know how to gauge his reactions. Which one? Arrow's face is blank. She doesn't understand the question. "The cellist or the sniper?" he asks, leaning forward. "The sniper," she says, her voice flat. She doesn't move, refuses to allow her body to reveal how she feels. Good. An assistant, a teenage boy who isn't old enough to shave, arrives in the room with a tray of coffee. Nermin takes one, hands the other to Arrow. She hesitates before accepting it, which prompts a look of surprise from Nermin. The boy retrieves his tray and leaves, shutting the door behind him. Nermin takes a sip. "You seem unhappy." Arrow says nothing. She drinks her coffee and keeps her eyes on the floor. For a while, neither of them speak. Then, quietly, in a tone Arrow has never heard him use before, he says, "Maybe you've done this for long enough. Maybe you should stop now." Arrow keeps her eyes on the floor. The sniper had the shot. He had it the whole time, but he didn't shoot. He was listening to the cellist play. Nermin shakes his head. "You don't understand me," she continues. "I killed him because he shot at me and because I couldn't trust him not to shoot later. I had no choice." "No, you didn't, but this has nothing to do with the cellist. The time has come for you to disappear." Arrow looks up. His bloodshot eyes stare at her. Disappear? He wets his lips and looks away. "I can't protect you anymore. The terms of our deal can no longer be honored." "I don't understand." Where, she wonders, am I to disappear to? The city is surrounded. No one can disappear, even if they want to. "The men on the hills have created many monsters," he says, "and not all of them are on the hills. There are those here who believe that they are in the right simply because they oppose something that is evil. They use this war in the city for their own ends, and I won't be part of it. If this is how the city will be once the war is over, then it's not worth saving." "What are they doing?" she asks. There are so many rumors these days she doesn't know what to believe. Most of them are easily dismissed as propaganda, but some of them make her wonder. Nermin takes a final sip of his coffee and sets the empty cup down on his desk. "You should disappear now so you don't have to find out." He stands, which in the past would have been her signal to leave, but she doesn't move from her chair. "What will happen to you?" He steps out from behind the desk and stands beside her. "I expect to be relieved of my command at any moment." Arrow stands, and when he leans in to kiss her on each cheek, she hugs him. Despite remaining always at a distance, he has become the closest thing to a friend she has. She turns to leave, and he grabs his shoulder, says to her back, "Your father would have never forgiven me for turning you into a soldier." Arrow doesn't turn around. She places her hand on his. "My father is dead," she says, "and I forgive you." As she walks out of his office and into the bright light of the street, her rifle feels heavier on her shoulder than ever before. She remembers what he said about the opposition of evil and wonders whether she might believe the same thing herself. Does she think she is good because she kills bad men? Is she? Does it matter why she kills them? She knows she no longer kills them because they are killing her fellow citizens. That's just part of it. She kills them because she hates them. Does the fact that she has good reason to hate absolve her? A month ago, she would have answered yes to this question. Now she wonders, who decides what is a good reason and what isn't? She doesn't know what will happen to Nermin. If he's right, if he is about to be relieved of his command, he will become a man without a place. The men on the hills will show him no mercy. Perhaps he has enough connections left to find a way out of Sarajevo. It would be hard. Most countries won't accept anyone who's been part of the fighting, and Nermin's high profile means that he won't be able to leave unnoticed. His best chance will be to stay out of sight until the war is over. If the men on the hills don't win, then perhaps things will change and he can reestablish himself in a time of peace. She's not sure exactly how a career soldier might do this, but lesser men have done greater things. She hopes that she is in someday a position to help him. She's gone about 3 blocks when the shelling starts. It's been a quiet day for the most part, but the sky is beginning to darken, and the men on the hills seem to have a fondness for marking the coming of night with shells. She often wondered if the shells remind them of fireworks. First they fall to the west, then Mohmilo, then Dobrynia. Then a few land closer across the river from Grbaca, and towards a river bank around Baskarya. Around her, people begin to move faster, heading home to the safety of cellars and basements, where they will likely spend the night. Arrow no longer goes into the basement of her building with the other residents when they're shelling. It doesn't seem worth it, given that she's in more danger during her average day than she is in the worst night of shelling. She'd just as soon sleep in her own bed. If she's going to die, that's where she'd like it to happen. It's a small measure of control over an uncontrollable situation. She's about to turn the corner and head north when a boy runs by her and clips her with his arm, almost knocking her over. He doesn't stop but glances back at her, and she recognizes him from Nermin's office, the one who brought coffee. He looks younger now, his face is frightened, almost white, and he's moving much faster than anyone else on the street. Several shells land on the hills above her, distracting her, and the boy is gone. She shakes her head. Why would Nermin have a boy on his staff if he's so easily terrified? Then she stops walking. He wouldn't. The boy isn't afraid of shelling. Something is wrong. She turns around and heads back towards Nermin, and her mind is all static, a poorly tuned radio, and she's surprised to find herself running. The stock of her rifle bounces against her ribs, bruising them, and her boots feel as if they're full of water, sloppy and awkward. Though it's less than a minute, it seems to take days to travel a few blocks. In a smooth and easy motion, she slips her rifle off of her shoulder and into her hands. Even as she's doing this, she acknowledges that it is simply a reflex. It's unlikely her rifle can solve whatever is happening. There's no time to ponder this insight, however, because a second after Nermin's office comes into view, an explosion hurtles the doors off the building, sending the plywood covering the windows flying through the air. A ball of fire follows, blowing outward and then sucking back in on itself. The street is showered with dust and debris. Arrow doesn't know if she was knocked off her feet by the explosion or if she went to the ground of her own volition. At first, she doesn't even notice that she's on her stomach watching the building burn through the scope of her rifle. Nermin's office is on the ground floor of a 3-story building. The rest of the building is also occupied by the military. Arrow doesn't know what's going on in the other rooms, but she knows right away that there wasn't anyone in them when the building exploded. Only one office would have had anyone in it. The fire brigade arrives and puts out the fire. Men in uniforms block off the building and conduct a search. They don't find any survivors. It's lucky, they say, that the shell fell after work hours, a small miracle. Arrow hears them talk to each other, can tell they all know it wasn't a shell that hit this building. No one wants to say it, or perhaps they're in on it. Either way, this explosion came from the inside and wasn't shell fire from the men on the hills, but no one says anything. After all, people are killed every day. Murder is commonplace. Why should this one be any different? For several hours, Arrow lingers, hoping that Nermin somehow escaped, that he had one more trick up his sleeve no one knew about it. Then, after almost everyone was gone, 2 soldiers come out of the building carrying a body wrapped in a blanket. They load it onto the back of a truck and drive off. She shoulders her rifle and turns away from the building and begins the long walk home. The bombarding hasn't let up at all. The men on the hills are having a busy night. Arrow lies in her bed, listens to the sound of shells falling, of automatic gunfire, of sirens. She wonders what will be left standing when morning comes, whether there will be any noticeable difference in the appearance of the city. There must come a point where so much has been turned into rubble that ruining a little more makes no difference. It's possible that point has already been reached. Does a person work the same way? She can't tell. It seems that she should be more upset about Nermin's death, or even angry, or more anything. She wants to be, but she isn't. She can't even claim to be surprised. It's cold tonight and the electricity is still off. She has no more firewood for her improvised wood stove, hasn't bothered to scrounge for any. She shivers under her blankets, gets up and goes to the hall closet for more, returns to bed and continues to shiver. Her stomach grumbles, protesting her small supper of rice and weak tea. She can't stand rice. She never ate it before the war, except in an Indian restaurant while on vacation. She doesn't remember disliking it before the war, but now the very thought of rice revolts her. It's all she has, though, all that's left from the last round of humanitarian aid. She gets paid in cigarettes by the army, which she trades for small things, like a square of chocolate or a bar of soap. She's managed to get a bag of apples a few weeks ago, and even though they were soft and mealy, they were well worth the ridiculous price she paid in a moment of weakness. She still has cigarettes to trade, a drawer full of them, but she can't be bothered. Seems a waste to her somehow, and she can't shake the feeling that she may need them later on. So she eats rice, works her way through the 10-kilogram sack in the corner of the kitchen, augmenting it with bread and weak tea. Disappear, Nermin told her. He's right. She should disappear. Her stash of cigarettes might be enough to buy a pass through the tunnel. She has no idea what that cost, but she can't stop thinking about Slavko's funeral, the fat man on the grave. Is there a difference between disappearing and going into a grave? Does it matter whether she succumbs to the wishes of the men on the hills or the men in the city? There is, of course, the question of survival. She doesn't want to die. She doesn't want to be shot by anyone, regardless of whether they're on the hills or in the city. But the young girl who was overcome by what it means to be alive, the girl who was so happy and afraid and awestruck that she had to pull her car to the side of the road, doesn't want to die either. That girl may be gone for now, may have no place in the city of today, but Arrow believes it's possible that someday she might return. And if Arrow disappears, she knows she's killing that girl. She'll not come back. Then there's the cellist. A part of her job is done. She's killed the sniper they sent. But if the cellist is true to his pledge, and Arrow believes he will be, then he is not yet finished. So they may send another sniper. They'll have trouble finding a willing man, knowing what happened to his predecessor, but it is possible they will try again. And where will she be if that happens? Will she be protecting the cellist? She wants to protect him. If it's in her power, she will. Arrow awakes to the sound of boots in the stairway. She doesn't remember falling asleep and feels as though she hasn't. But her eyes open and she knows that the boots she hears are not on the feet of any of her neighbors. There's a pounding at the door. She gets out of bed, pulls on her clothes, and opens the drawer to the small table beside her bed. She takes out her father's revolver, the gun he used during his time as a police officer, and puts it in the pocket of her coat. Her rifle sits on the table in the kitchen, clean and ready, but she leaves it where it is. Whoever is there continues hammering away, and she hears her neighbor's door open. There's a pause during which no words are spoken, then the neighbor's door closes again. Arrow checks that her gun is loaded, then answers the door. 3 men wait on the other side. One of them has his fist raised, ready to strike the door again, and the other 2 stand farther back from him. They carry guns, appearing casual. She knows they're anything but. They all wear hiking boots. The one who's knocking is wearing green fatigues and an army jacket with a patch bearing the country's insignia sewn on it. The other 2 wear street clothes with no identifying badges on them at all. The man in green looks at her in a way that reminds her of the men used to look at her in nightclubs. He pauses before speaking, looking at the other 2. Are you Arrow? His voice is intended to sound tough, but it comes across as almost comic. Possibly. What do you want? Her hand is in her coat pocket, but she hasn't decided what to do yet. She could kill all 3 of them before they even raise their weapons, but that doesn't seem like the correct course of action. They don't appear to pose an immediate threat to her. They're more likely messengers. Don't shoot the messenger, the old saying goes, though she can't remember exactly why. She decides to make no move for now. Come with us. Arrow pauses, wonders what her choices are. Does a refusal mean she must kill these men? I don't think so, she says. The 2 at the rear move their hands on their guns to a less casual position, raise the barrels slightly, and Arrow gets the answer to her question. This is not a request, the man in front says, though she can see it is. He is jumpy, she thinks. These men have heard of her. They might not be sure if the stories they've heard are true, but they've heard enough to be afraid. She feels pleased momentarily, and then is irritated with herself for reveling in the fear of others. She never wanted anyone to fear her. Where are we going? She asks, her voice low and smooth. She wants them to know that they do not intimidate her. To see Colonel Karimun, he says. Bring your rifle. Arrow waits, lets them sweat it out a while she decides what she'll do. She can say no, and she'll have to kill these 3 men, which will result in her being a fugitive. It seems easier and more prudent to go with them. She has never heard of a Colonel Karimun, and that makes her nervous. She nods and walks away from them into the kitchen. She picks up her rifle and returns to the door. She closes the door, and the three men fall in step with her, the one in jeans beside her and the other two behind. She gets the distinct feeling they are treating her as a prisoner. Arrow steps out of a blue BMW and is directed to wait while one of the men goes inside a cafe in a narrow street just north of the library. The other two men stand nearby, smoking, but they don't try to talk to her. After a few minutes, the first man returns and motions for her to follow him. The inside of the cafe is poorly lit and the air is stale. The windows have been barricaded with sandbags, and there's very little furniture left in the room. At a table in the back corner sits a man in uniform. He is in his late 40s and his hair and beard are graying. His face is tanned, his eyes an indistinguishable shade of brown. He looks hard, a man used to fighting. Arrow is immediately aware that he'd make a dangerous enemy. "Sit," he says, pushing a chair with one of his feet, "and leave your rifle by the door." Arrow sets her rifle down gently and sits. She feels uneasy, aware the situation is getting out of hand. She waits for the man to speak, eager to try and find a way to regain some control over what will happen. "My name is Colonel Eden Karimun," the man says, his voice curt. "You are known as Arrow?" "Yes." "And what is your real name?" He looks at her, expecting an answer. Arrow straightens her spine and looks back at him. "Arrow is as real a name as I have," she says. He pauses. "It doesn't matter," he says. "If I needed to know your name, I'd already know it." He takes a file of some papers sitting on the table, opens it, and lights a cigarette. "Your unit has been disbanded. You've been reassigned to me." He doesn't look at her as he says this, but Arrow is aware that he is gauging her reaction. "What about Nermin Filipovic?" "Filipovic has been killed, as you are aware." He looks up. "I've been watching you for some time. You possess an impressive range of abilities." Arrow looks at Eden Karaman's hands. They are smooth, clean, and have no calluses. They are at odds with the rest of him. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to continue what you've been doing," he says, closing the file, "but under my direction." "No," Arrow says, "that's not how I work." He smiles. "You misunderstand." Arrow shakes her head. "I don't think I do." "Yes," he says, "you are very much mistaken. I am not asking you, I am ordering you. We are at war. I didn't ask for this to be a war, but they insisted, and now they must bear the results. You are a part of the solution and will act as such." "I have an assignment already," she says, "which I must finish." She is sweating, feels a drop trickle down the back of her calf. "The cellist is of no longer your concern. We've assigned someone else to him." He inhales a deep drag of a cigarette. "Why?" "Because I say so. Filipovic has misused your talents, allowed you to be wasted on ordinary soldiers and irrelevant endeavors like this cellist business. Eden Karaman stands. You will go with the men outside. They will take you to meet your spotter. He will give you the details of your first assignment." Arrow doesn't get up. She places her hand on the table and stares at him. "I don't work with a spotter. I choose my own targets." He looks down at her. "No, you don't. Again, I remind you that you are not being presented with a choice here. You will do what is required to defend the city as decided by me. Now go." She hesitates, unsure of what to do. She has been naive and has lost control over herself. She is entirely without options. As she rises to her feet and turns to leave, she wonders what her father would say to her if he were alive. Did he know this would happen? Did he understand better than she realized the mechanics of a war and the people who operate on each side in a war? She doubts it. He was just a father wanting his daughter to be safe. He couldn't have known that she would be so good at killing, or that this skill would make her vulnerable. "One last thing," he calls. She turns to face him. His face is severe, his hands folded in front of him. Some in this city like to think that this war is more complicated than it really is. In case you are one of those people, I will tell you the reality of Sarajevo. There is us, and there is them. Everyone, and I mean everyone, falls into one of these two categories. I hope you know where you stand." He unfolds his hand and waves her away, the way one would shoo a fly off of a dinner plate. Arrow bends down and picks up her rifle. Its familiar weight comforts her. If they want her to kill the men on the hills, then fine. She will kill the men on the hills. Whatever has happened in her life, the choices she has already made, they have led her to this point. All that remain are the consequences.